In this video, we'll take a look at note mode, which allows you to play, edit, and sequence notes in a variety of ways. This mode consists of two submodes, a scale submode and a drum submode. These will be selected automatically based on the contents of the track. This track contains an instrument rack, so the scale submode is selected. If I switch to a track that contains a drum rack, now the drum submode will be selected. The drum submode has two different layouts, a drum rack layout as you can see here, and an impulse layout which will be selected if I switch to a track that contains impulse. Before discussing the details of this mode, I'll give you a quick example of how this mode can be used. Both of the submodes share some of the same functionality, so we'll take a look at that first. By default, the pads are used for playing instruments. When full is turned on, the notes that you play will have full velocity regardless of how hard you hit the pads. When note repeat is turned on, holding down a pad will play repeated notes. You can control the velocity of the repeated notes by applying pressure to the pads. You can change the rate of the repeated notes with the display buttons. You can also use the quantization settings that were shown in a previous video for applying swing to the repeated notes. Both submodes also allow for step sequencing. You can turn step sequencing on and off with the step button. The last pad that was played prior to pressing the step button will be selected for sequencing. The majority of the display buttons select the velocity to use when adding steps. When random is turned on, the last four display buttons select the maximum random velocity to use. And when input is selected, the velocity of steps will be determined by how hard you hit the pads. The first two display buttons navigate between pads to sequence. So here I'll navigate down to my snare pad and then my kick pad. When mute is held down, the pads can toggle the mute state of existing steps or insert muted steps. The select button allows you to select steps for use with one of the encoder modes. The note repeat button allows you to switch between step editing and edit position selection. When this button is turned on, the display buttons select the resolution to use for sequencing. The lower 8 pads select the portion of the clip to loop. The upper 8 pads select the portion of the clip to edit. When shift is held down, the upper 8 pads can be used to select the edit and loop position. Here I'll select the first page so I can add some 16th notes to the first bar, and then the second page so I can add some 16th notes to the second bar. Now I'll select both pages. Notice that when I do this, the step sequencer automatically switches between pages. And finally, holding down erase and pressing one of the upper pads will delete all the notes from that page. Both submodes also allow the pads to be used for editing notes. When quantize is held down, pressing a pad will quantize the notes associated with that pad. When erase is held down, pressing a pad will delete notes. If the clip is playing, this will instead erase notes that the playhead is currently passing over. When solo is held down, pressing a pad will solo notes. And when mute is held down, pressing a pad will mute notes. Holding down shift and pressing mute will unmute all notes. In the scale submode, the pads will be assigned to a particular scale. You can switch between scale types with the type buttons. You can switch between root notes with the root buttons. You can move between octaves with the octave buttons. When the shift button is held down, the octave buttons will move the pads up or down by one semitone. This submode also has a capture function, which allows you to capture the notes from a clip and assign them to the pads. You can do that by pressing the cap button. And lastly, in this sub-mode, the Group A button functions like a sustain pedal. In the drum sub-mode, the impulse layout is very basic. It simply allows you to play impulse. The drum rack layout is a bit more advanced. You can of course play the drum rack. You can use the DR pause buttons to select which part of the drum rack to play. You can select drum rack pads by holding down select and pressing the pads. You can solo drum rack pads by holding down select plus solo and pressing the pads. You can unsolo all drum rack pads by holding down shift plus select and pressing solo. You can mute drum rack pads by holding down select plus mute and pressing the pads. And you can unmute all drum rack pads by holding down shift and select and pressing mute. In your user preferences file, you can customize the LED colors to use for drum mode. You can also create associations between LED colors and pad names. I've set up a few examples here. Every pad with the word kick in its name will be purple. Every pad with either snare or clap in their name will be amber. And every pad with HH, shaker, or tam will be white. These associations that you create will work with any drum rack that you load. To give you an example of how this looks, here you can see my kick pads are purple, my snares and claps are amber, my hi-hats and percussion are white, and all other pads are yellow.